Should we start?
Sure.
Can folks see both of us or just John? All right. Hello. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the first virtual edition in our regular programming lineup of Life Science Cafe. I am Kadambari Devarajan, a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and I will be your host for today. We will be in conversation with Dr. John Rowan on paleontology, new insights from old bones. Established in 2011, Life Science Cafe is organized by graduate student scientists at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Each month, we invite different experts in the field of life science to discuss their research and answer questions about their field. Typically, we host these events in the Amherst community, but in light of recent events, we have moved to an online format. We would first like to thank our funding sources, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology Program, the Graduate Student Senate and the Graduate School at UMass, the National Science Foundation, and our UMass Gives donors. We are really happy you joined us for this virtual edition of Science Cafe. If you haven't attended a Science Cafe before and are interested in attending some in the future, please subscribe to our mailing list found on oebsciencecafe.org. Our next cafe will also be on Zoom sometime in June and will feature Dr. Paige Warren and her research on urban ecology, how cities domesticate nature. Stay tuned for future cafes. For those of you new to Zoom webinars, you should be able to see your host, which is me, and the speaker, John. You will also be able to see our slides when one of us shares our screen. To prevent unexpected background noise, all audience members can expect to be muted throughout the event. The chat functionality will also be disabled for all attendees. You may ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible after each vignette or section. So I will ask the speaker questions in 3 vignettes of about 15 minutes each, with a pause for audience questions between each vignette. You will be able to ask questions during the Q&A function, using the Q&A function in Zoom, and John will respond live to the questions during the designated Q&A sessions between the vignettes. And all live questions will be moderated. So our 3 vignettes for today are paleontology in history, paleontology in practice, and the application of paleontology in conservation. So it would be great if you could keep the vignette topics, history, practice, and conservation in mind when you're asking questions. Now let's dive straight in with all the announcements out of the way. John, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm John Rowan. I'm John Rowan. I'm the Darwin Fellow in Organismic and Evolutionary Biology here at UMass. I did my PhD at ASU, or Arizona State University, in 2018, and I've been at UMass since then. So I'm very happy to be here, and happy to be here today talking with everybody.
Thanks, John, for that quick introduction. And so we'll just go straight ahead with our first first question of our vignette. So fossils are objects of fascination for many people. Has this always been the case?
It has. People have been aware of fossils for thousands of years, all the way back into prehistory. And so I put some examples here from prehistory. These are Stone Age peoples who were aware of fossils. They didn't realize they were remnants of ancient organisms, but they served presumably some symbolic purpose to them. So here you have a stone tool with a fossil shell in the middle, and here's a grave, and these are actually all fossil shells surrounding the grave. So people have been interacting with fossils for thousands, if not millions of years. To jump to historic times, to ancient Egypt, this is sort of a fun example. This is a tomb that was excavated in the last century, and within it, there were 2 to 3 tons. You can see, I hope everybody can see my mouse, these linen wrappings, and in them, like I said, were 2 to 3 tons of fossil animal bones, mostly of hippopotamus. Sorry, there are gonna be some glitches here.
Yeah, so John, there's a slight lag between your, when you're transitioning between slides. So yeah, just giving you a heads up on that.
Thank you. I'll take my time here. Anyway, this is a tomb loaded with animal fossils that were collected by ancient Egyptians. Like I said, they're mostly hippopotamus, and we know this is a grave to the Egyptian god Seth, which is commonly depicted as hippopotamus. So this is an example of people thousands of years ago seeking out and collecting fossils. To jump to the Mediterranean, another fun example are the dwarf elephants. In the Mediterranean in the last million years on various islands, dwarfed elephants evolved, and their remains, you can see the skeleton here, are very common in the caves of Greece and Italy. And some have proposed this is the origin of the Cyclops myth, because you can see the elephant skull here, there's this large opening. This is where the trunk actually attaches, but it's assumed it was mistaken for an eye and may have sourced the Cyclops myth. And the last example I want to highlight here is the mythology of griffins, which travelers on the Silk Road came back with stories about lion-sized animals with beaks that were found in red cliffs and guarded gold in the wilderness. And actually there are vast regions of Mongolia, this is the flaming cliffs in the background here, that are loaded with fossils of the dinosaur Protoceratops, which I've shown here. Again, likely the source of one of the world's most famous myths. So people in both prehistory and in ancient history were well aware of fossil remains. They just didn't appreciate them to be extinct organisms until relatively recently, only the last few hundred years.
Wow, that's really cool. So from the examples that you gave with respect to prehistory and all these fossils, let's jump a little bit ahead. And so I want to ask you, I've heard that the pursuit of paleontology often involves a lot of drama. Can you share any interesting stories in the context of American history? Like, can you tell us a little bit about fossils in the context of American history?
Sure, and some of the best examples come from Thomas Jefferson, our third president, who is widely considered to be the father of American paleontology. Jefferson, as many people will know, was far more interested in science than politics, and he was particularly interested in American natural history, largely because leading scientists at the time, like Buffon in France, pushed theories of, quote unquote, American degeneracy, that the plants and the animals of the Americas were somehow weaker or a watered down version of that of Eurasia or Africa. And that really annoyed Jefferson and basically sparked a crusade that would last decades to show that, America had great wildlife too. And so one of the best examples, it doesn't involve paleontology, is Jefferson had a moose in New Hampshire shot and sent its rotting carcass to the doorstep of Buffon to show him how big, the hoofed mammals of the Americas were. But how paleontology fits into all of this is actually if we go back to Jefferson's only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, in his quest to disprove American degeneracy, he's listed here the weights of various animals in Europe, you can see, and in America, and he's comparing them. And some of this is quite a bit of embellishment. Like, for example, you see here domesticates, and he's comparing weights of cows, and he says, the cows in the Americas weigh 2,500 pounds compared to cows of Europe that only weigh about 700. But as far as paleontology is concerned, I want to point to right over here, this box. He lists mammoths, and as we know today, mammoths are extinct, but in the late 1700s, that wasn't very clear. The concept of extinction wasn't widely understood as it is today. And so Jefferson was very familiar with bones of mammoths that were being found in farmers' fields, and he thought, because extinction never happened, that they were still to be found somewhere out in America. And so I'm not sure many people know this, but actually one of the major objectives he had for the Lewis and Clark expedition was to hunt down mammoths in the American West. And he specifically instructed William Clark to procure a living specimen and try to bring it back. Obviously they didn't find any. They did find lots of mammoth fossils, but didn't stop them from looking.
That's so fascinating.
It's a funny story. But the thing I really want to focus on here is probably the thing Jefferson, in terms of paleo, is best known for. And that is when he was sent a series of bones from a cave in West Virginia that clearly were not mammoth. They had large claws. This is a picture of the bones here. And he wrote probably the most descriptive title for a scientific paper, a memoir on the discovery of certain bones of a quadruped of the clawed kind in the western parts of Virginia. And he gave a talk on this to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And Jefferson didn't know what to make of the bones. He speculated that they might belong to a giant lion. And in fact, Lewis and Clark, when they went off on their expedition, were looking for giant American lions as well. We know today these bones aren't, or they don't belong to a lion. In fact, they belong to basically icons of the American Pleistocene, these giant ground sloths, which roamed North America up until about 12,000 years ago. And this one here, Megalonyx, which was Jefferson's name, is actually named after him. It's Megalonyx jeffersoni is the species. Kind of a fun story.
Yeah, that is a fun story. So, like zoning in from like North America in general, let's go a little local with the Pioneer Valley. And many of us know that the Pioneer Valley has a long history of paleontology, and many of us would have gotten a glimpse of this at the Penske Museum in Amherst. So can you tell us more about fossils in the context of local Massachusetts history?
Sure. The first fossils that were really found or were well known in the Americas actually come right from South Hadley. They're not bone fossils, they're footprints that many of you probably know about. But they were discovered in 1802 when a young farm boy was tilling his father's farm and came across these giant three-toed footprints you see here. And the myth was, or the word that got out about them was that this had been Noah's raven that he had sent off from the ark, and it had landed in South Hadley, Massachusetts, and here are his giant footprints. But they weren't actually the subject of scientific study until about 30 years later, when Edward Hitchcock, who was a professor of chemistry and natural history at Amherst College, began traveling all throughout the Connecticut Valley studying these remains. And he published a large monograph, this book here, Ichnology of New England. Ichnology is the word he used to name the study of fossil footprints. And so in this book, in 1858, he described all the footprints he had found around Amherst, Greenfield, South Hadley, as belonging to giant birds. And you can see them here. They're very bird-like. We know today they're actually the remains of, or the imprints of dinosaurs. But Hitchcock would go to his grave thinking he had found giant birds that once roamed Massachusetts.
Wow, that is so curious. So that brings us to the end of the first section. Should we move on to throw the floor open for audience questions?
Sure. I just want to point out here real
Sure.
fast. I forgot. Here's it. Many of you have probably been to the Beninsky Museum today, as shown here on the right. But this is actually Hitchcock's original collection here. This is a photo from the archives at Amherst College. But yeah, let's move to Q&A. So
that's really nice to see, like, how the Hitchcock Museum was many years ago. A lot of us are only familiar with what we see now.
right.
Which is great. So let's see if we have any audience questions. So folks, there's I'll just repeat instructions for those who are not familiar with Zoom webinars. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And okay, so, and you should be able to ask your question there, and as your moderator, I'll pick and choose questions to ask John. So we have the first question, John, from our attendees is, are there digs going on now locally?
The thing with New England is a lot of the most famous fossils here are actually footprints. As far as the actual bones of, say, dinosaurs or the large mammals that lived in the Pleistocene, a lot of those come from the American West, where we actually have the sediments that are eroding out. Because here it's so flat, there's not much erosion going on. There's not much active paleontological work happening.
Nice. So, so the short version is it's mostly happening a little further west.
Right.
Right. Okay. So our next question is, what is the largest fossil collection in the US and where is it found?
That depends on what specific type of animal or plant you're interested in. So if you're interested in dinosaurs, some of the most famous dinosaurs come from what's called the Morrison Formation, which is exposed mostly in Colorado and Utah. If you're interested in mammals, there are plenty of mammals from a site in Kentucky that William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition found. It's called Big Bone Lick, and it's loaded with fossils. But also for mammals, Rancho La Brea in downtown Los Angeles. So there's lots of really rich, I mean, America has tons of rich paleontological sites. It just, they're sort of scattered throughout the country.
Nice. So the next question to you is, when were mammoths deemed extinct, and was it a controversial theory at the time?
Mammoths?
Mammoths, yeah.
Yeah.
So when were they thought to have gone extinct, and was it controversial, the whole notion?
So we know now that mammoths, at least in continental North America, disappear about 12,000 years ago. But the history of the discovery of mammoths is actually really interesting because it's how extinction was discovered. Cuvier, who was a French anatomist, was sent bones of what we know today are mammoths from the Americas, and he compared them to African elephants, he compared them to Asian elephants, and he realized that they were neither, and therefore must belong to an extinct animal because nobody would miss a third species of elephant today. And so that's sort of what got the ball rolling in his realization that extinction happens and there's a world that existed, you know, that's outside human existence, or human knowledge, I should say, because humans were around 12,000 years ago.
So we have time for a couple of more questions. I think we're doing well on time, so I'll pose both of those to you. The first one is, did the Egyptians have complete skeletons in their graves in addition to the fossils depicted in your slides?
Not that I know of. So the fossils that were collected by Egyptians are actually about 2 million years old. They come from a period we call the early Pleistocene. And during that time, what is today, regions of the Sahara was actually covered by grassland, and it would look very much like you'd see in East African savanna with lots of large animals. But when the Egyptians were collecting those bones, it seems that they just grabbed bits and pieces. They weren't collecting whole skeletons, but they certainly collected a lot of bones. Like I said, the one grave has 2 to 3 tons of fossil material in it.
Cool. So the final question we have to wrap up this vignette is, are we still pulling fossils out of the ground with no idea what they are?
Not really. I mean, new species are being discovered, but in terms of our understanding of life's chronology, we have a really good understanding. It's very rare that things are overly surprising. Sure, there are new species found, but it's not like there are whole groups of, organisms remain to be discovered, it seems.
Awesome. So that last question actually provides us with a really nice jumping point into our second vignette, which is how does paleontology happen in practice? In that vignette, my first question to you is, so your work focuses on fossil mammals from the East African Rift Valley. And so can you tell us about why you decided to, what fascinates you about fossils in general, and why you chose mammals, and why the East African Rift Valley?
Sure. So I'm broadly interested in the ecology and evolution of mammals. And anybody that's watched Planet Earth or another nature documentary knows Africa has more large-bodied mammals than anywhere else in the world. Elephants, lions, zebras. But the amazing thing when looking to Africa's fossil record is that the present diversity of animals we have there is actually only a faint reflection of its former diversity. And so if you're interested in long-term ecology or questions of ecology and evolution, Africa is a great place to work. You've got a ton of diversity today, but even more in the past. So here I've put some pictures just from my work in Kenya and Ethiopia. We have giant carnivores that are 5 times the size of lions. We have otters that are the size of grizzly bears. We have a various diversity of herbivores like this antelope. There are, of course, tons of fossil apes. Hippos. It's just an incredible diversity, even recently in the last million years, that has disappeared. So you can address major outstanding questions about ecology, evolution, extinction in Africa, unlike most other places of the world. But the other reason why working in Africa is so interesting is it's the region in which humans evolved. As Darwin famously predicted that humans had evolved in Africa, that is now confirmed by a huge and what seems like an ever-growing fossil record. The human fossil record, more than any other group of organisms, is really rich. So these are examples just from Ethiopia and Kenya, where we've got remains of human ancestors like the skull here that are fairly ape-like, to things that, like the skeleton down here, are decisively more human-like. So the story of human evolution is almost exclusively an African story. And so studies of the region's fossil mammals shed light on sort of the broader ecological context of human origins and evolution.
Do you think you could walk us through in the previous slide and in this one, like what the different fossils are before we move on?
Sure. So this is I'll start up here. Everybody can see my cursor, right? This is a giant carnivore from about 20 million years ago named Simba Kubwa, which is not closely related to any carnivore we have today. It's a totally extinct lineage. This is a fossil antelope here. Here is a fossil ape called Australopithecus. Down here is another fossil ape, Afarensis. These teeth are the remains of a giant giraffe. We had giant giraffes larger than elephants in the past. Here is another fossil ape. And then these are various bones of a hippopotamus here, a rhinoceros, zebras. But this is just, a grab bag of fossils. It's just, if you ever get to visit Ethiopia or Kenya, go to the national museums, because
And are they all?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sorry. No, I was just asking, are they all from the same site, or are they all from Ethiopia?
No, the jaw up here is from Kenya. The fossil apes here are from Kenya. The giraffe and the antelope are from Ethiopia, so all over. But Tanzania has beautiful fossil collections, as does South Africa. So, and then to go forward to this slide, there's a lot of material in here. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I'll highlight up here, these two skulls are remains of Lucy species and species closely related to Lucy. This is Australopithecus Afarensis up here. This is Lucy species here, Australopithecus Afarensis. This skull down here is actually fairly modern. It's one of the earliest modern humans, or Homo sapiens, we have in the fossil record. And I can talk more about the other ones. I don't want to take up too much time.
Okay.
I could stand here all day talking about it.
And it would be a fascinating story, I'm sure. So now that we know sort of what you're interested in and how you got interested in this, like, what are some questions in particular that your team has been interested in, and how do you go about addressing those questions? Like, how do paleontologists go about identifying and answering questions about the fossil record? Like, we're talking deep time and over large geographical spaces, and so, like, how does this happen?
Sure. So since we're on the topic of human origins, I want to use that as an example. So the team I work with in Ethiopia, we've been, in the last few years, interested in tracking the origin of the genus Homo, which is the broader group to which we belong. Our scientific name is Homo sapiens, but there are tons of fossil species of our genus, the genus Homo, in the African fossil record. And they appear rather abruptly. So by 2 million years ago, I've shown here 3 different species that coexisted in Kenya together. That they're clearly, in terms of their anatomy, different lineages or different branches of evolution, but there's enough similarities among them that we recognize them as closely related. Because the 3 of them coexist at 2 million years ago, that implies that sometime in the past, beyond 2 million years ago, they shared an ancestor, right? And that's what I've shown here in this schematic. And yet, because of a major gap in the fossil record, we didn't have a record of that ancestor. So if you looked at the fossil record of the genus Homo just a few years ago, it looked something like this. Here I've shown time, 3 million years ago, 2.5, up to 2 million years ago. And basically what you'd have in the fossil record is you have Lucy species, I've shown here, Australopithecus Afarensis, existing in time up until about 2.9 million years ago. Then we have a major gap, and when we pick the record back up around 2 million years ago, we have the 3 species of Homo that I just talked about. And so we were interested to see if we could find rocks of the right age and of the right type to fill this gap and to get a better understanding of the origin of our genus. And so we started looking in a place called Lady Gararu in Ethiopia, which is close to the Lucy site, but we had a hunch that the rocks there might be a little bit younger. And indeed, that's the case. In 2013, we found this little jaw, which was our first hint that these were fossil-bearing rocks. This little jaw certainly belongs to the genus Homo. It's not Lucy's species, but we didn't know how old it was. Fortunately, this is the hill it was found on. At the bottom of that hill, which I've highlighted here with the white line, there's a layer of volcanic ash, which we can date. And when we date it, that layer of volcanic ash is 2.8 million years old. So 800,000 years older than the 3 species of Homo I had talked about that existed at 2 million years. So based on the anatomy of this little jawbone and its age, this provides our first glimpse at what the ancestor of later species of Homo may have looked like. And we announced the discovery of this jawbone in 2015, but now we have remains of teeth and skulls and some exciting stuff, but none of that's published yet. We're still working on it, so.
I'll look forward to reading them once they are published. That's so cool, John.
Thank you.
So a clarifying question. So Lucy, the fossil is super important and can be found now in at the National Museum in Addis Ababa.
Yep. She's actually in a bank vault. So a couple of researchers donated a bunch of bank vaults to the National Museum of Ethiopia a few years ago. And so to get to Lucy, you have to go up 4 flights of steps. You go through 3 series of locked doors, and then you have to go into a room, and inside that room is a bank vault, and she's inside the bank vault.
Wow, so what's visible to all the visitors at the museum is actually like a cast and not the actual.
Yeah, so most of the time when you go to a natural history museum, the bones you're actually seeing are just replicas of the original fossil material, which is locked away for researchers to come study and for security reasons, obviously, so.
That's awesome. So you explained like how the gap was filled. So with that gap in the fossil record filled, what other questions does your team have about this key event, the origin of the genus Homo in our evolution?
Sure, so we have a big team of researchers that work in Lady Gararu, and we all do different things. So I don't work on the fossil humans. I'm the expert on the fossil animals, especially the large mammals, but we've got a team of geologists, geochemists, paleontologists, archaeologists, all working together as this one entity, the Lady Gararu project. But from my side of things, one of the most interesting things we see at the Lady Gararu site pertains to the animals that are recovered alongside that, our fossil ancestor, the earliest Homo. So some of the most common remains we have from Lady Gararu are things like wildebeest. You can see the skull here of a nice fossil wildebeest. And we have lots of horses. They're not actually zebras. They belong to an extinct group of 3-toed horses, but they're really abundant. And so the important thing is that basically the dominant animals we find at the site are indicative of grassland environments. They all eat grasses. They're mostly, ungulates that live in herds. And that signals a couple of things, but perhaps the most important is this represents a major transition in the evolution of African ecosystems. The mammal communities and ecosystems we have preserved older than 2.8 million years ago mostly come from woodland or forest contexts. And at Lady Gararu, 2.8 million years ago, it's the first time we're picking up Serengeti-like grassland ecosystems in the fossil record, at least from Africa.
So we all know that science doesn't happen in isolation, and particularly field work, and that's like the photo with your team is a beautiful illustration of the amount of effort and teamwork that goes and collaboration that happens in a lot of this kind of research.
Indeed, yeah, it's a huge group effort. So, and this isn't even a picture of everybody on the project. So it's paleontological fieldwork is kind of a model for how interdisciplinary science can work, because you need experts in so many different fields to address these big picture questions in the fossil record.
So with that, do you think we should go ahead and ask our audience to hit you with questions?
Sure.
So again, if you have a question, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom and ask away. So our first question is, do you have a favorite extinct mammal?
I don't have a favorite, But I am, the mammals I work on the most in terms of figuring out what species they are, naming new species, figuring out their evolutionary relationships. I work on fossil antelope and fossil giraffes. And most people say, oh my God, that's so boring when I tell them that. You can work on dinosaurs, you can work on carnivores. And when you tell them you're an expert on fossil antelope, they say, okay, I'm gonna go find somebody else to talk to.
So what's so fascinating about these herbivores, like these ancient grazers and browsers?
I'm interested in them because they're so tightly tied to the ecosystems or the vegetation communities within which they live. And so just the fossil herbivores from a site alone can tell us a lot about what sort of paleo environment is represented.
And we now have our next question. So what was the most exciting find in Africa that you were involved in?
The discovery of that little jawbone, it's not even a whole jawbone, it's half of one, was pretty exciting because it's a question this team has been trying to tackle for 20 odd years. And it got a lot of press. It was pretty exciting. There is some exciting stuff in the pipeline that I can't really talk about, but will be coming out soon. So, but the people I work with get so excited when we find fossil humans, and I get most excited when we find new fossil antelopes. So maybe I'm the wrong person to talk to.
So while we're waiting for the next question, I have a question to ask, which is, so when you clearly have an idea about this place looks reasonable. It's not just that you just go out and then randomly start digging and then you find a fossil and then it becomes this huge new thing. So you have to have a clear picture and am I correct in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people have the perception that you stumble upon fossils and then you describe it and it's done. But modern paleontological fieldwork is just a different form of hypothesis testing. Like I said with the example of the three species of Homo, 2 million, we know they share an ancestor older than that time. We know approximately where that ancestor should live in terms of the broader geographic region, and we know approximately what time period we need to hit to find that ancestor. So we know where to look, we know basically the age of the rocks we need to look into, we know the types of rocks we need to look at because not all rocks preserve fossils. So there's a lot of groundwork that goes into deciding where to start a project. It's not just, walking around and stumbling upon an interesting find.
So now we're having a whole flurry of really fun questions. So whatever I can ask you now before we move on to the third vignette, I'll shoot them away and then we'll put the rest on hold until after we finish the vignette. So our first question is it possible to get DNA from fossils, and what can you tell from fossil pre-human teeth?
Sure. So first things first, the DNA from fossils. We can get DNA from fossils, but it takes the right conditions. Normally, the places where we can get DNA out of fossils occur at high latitudes like Europe or in some cases North America, because the cold climates preserve DNA better than warm tropical climates. So in Africa, I'm not going to hold my breath for getting DNA out of any fossils there anytime soon. But certainly, Neanderthals, we have a whole genome sequence for, simply because the regions of the world they're preserved in. And then what was the second question? Sorry.
So what can we understand from pre-human teeth was the question.
We can understand a lot. Teeth tell you most of the major things or questions you'd have about an organism. They can tell you to what other species it's related to. They can tell you how big the animal was, what they ate, etc. And all those things hold true for the teeth of our ancestors too. We know a lot about the evolutionary relationships of various fossil humans and what they ate simply just from remains of teeth that we find. And we have a whole suite of tools that we use to get at that. So instead of just looking at the shape of the teeth, we can actually drill them for isotopes and reconstruct diet using carbon and oxygen isotopes, which we do all the time in Africa.
So the next question is, how did the fauna change with the change from woodlands to grasslands? And then we maybe have time for one more, and the rest we'll sort of relegate to after the next vignette.
Sure. There's a major turnover in the fauna with the shift to grassland environments. We know we're detecting grassland environments in the fossil record, in part because of the fauna, but we have other independent lines of evidence. We have fossilized soils that preserve root cast or little nodules of carbonate we can drill for isotopes and reconstruct how much woody vegetation or how much grassy vegetation there was on the landscape through time. And so with the first expansion of grassland ecosystems in Africa, you get a fundamental upheaval of the faunal communities. You get plenty of extinction, and then basically the radiation of new groups of animals, like the grazing antelope and the horses I mentioned.
Right. So I think this one would be a quick one. So after this, we'll move on. How accurate are artists' representations of extinct mammals, in your opinion?
It depends. I mean, there's a lot of people who do paleo art. I think, you know, if you go back and look at paleo art 10 years ago, it's very different from paleo art today. If you go back 50 or 100 years ago, even more different still. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of it is informed by people who know a lot about anatomy, but there's always a little bit of artistic freedom, we should say, in creating those reconstructions.
Right. So with that, those were a bunch of great, fun questions. Thanks to the audience for keeping them coming. And we'll move on to the final vignette. And after that, we'll address whatever questions we have and any others that we can field. So the third vignette is the application of paleontology to conservation. And so my question to you, John, is the fossil record is the lens through which we view our planet's past, but what lessons might the fossil record have for where we're headed?
Sure. So I just want to focus for this last vignette really on one topic, which is the biodiversity crisis the world faces today. It'll surprise nobody in this webinar that we're undergoing massive human-driven transformation of the world's ecosystems. It includes climate change, pollution, the destruction of wild lands, illegal hunting, etc. You could make a list that would last this whole webinar of how humans are affecting, often in negative ways, the natural world. And so in thinking about biodiversity loss today, the fossil record really provides our yardstick or our barometer for understanding extinction intensity and patterns of species loss today. And so a lot of people will hear in the media about the quote unquote 6 mass extinction. I'm highlighting the mammoth up here. And what that refers to are a series of major losses of biodiversity through Earth's history. We recognize 5 major ones. The first here, the Ordovician Silurian, one in the late Devonian, another in the Permo-Triassic, the Triassic-Jurassic, and the last one, which is the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, when we lost most of the non-bird dinosaurs, or all of the non-bird dinosaurs, rather. And we talk a lot about the 6th extinction today as the Earth's most recent mass extinction driven by humans. And the question is the label of a mass extinction appropriate for the anthropogenic extinctions we're experiencing today and have been for the last few centuries? And so I want to show these 2 figures. These are from 2 recent papers. I'll explain this graph here first. And so what you're looking at here on this axis, cumulative extinctions as a percentage of evaluated species. This is basically the percentage of species in these different groups that have gone extinct since 1500. And so you can see mammals is the blue line, birds, the yellow line here, or other vertebrates, the other yellow line. But we can use the fossil record to I mean, obviously extinction happens all the time. And so one of the questions we have is, well, what's a normal rate of extinction? In other words, what is the background rate of extinction? Species originate and go extinct all the time. How different are the losses we're experiencing today in terms of species extinctions from what we'd expect given the fossil record? And that's what this dotted black line is here. That's basically the rate of background extinction we would expect given what we know about how long species persist in the fossil record. And obviously what you see is the rates of loss we're experiencing today are totally, they're way higher than we would expect for quote unquote normal extinction. Whether this constitutes mass extinction is a different issue, but it's more a semantic one. It's almost a moot point. This is obvious enough that the rates of extinction we're experiencing are abnormal. And then to highlight this figure here, this is showing essentially species for which populations are declining and the percentage of them that are either endangered or of low conservation concern. And the unfortunate situation is that many species that are on the decline are those that are also endangered. And so while we're losing species at an unprecedented rate today in terms of human impacts, that situation seems like it's going to only get worse over the next 100 years or so.
So, like you mentioned, and like a lot of us know, large mammals are at the forefront of biodiversity losses today. So what lessons does the fossil record have for potential consequences of the large mammal losses that are occurring?
Sure. So large mammals are particularly sensitive to human impacts, and we know that in large part from looking at the fossil record. So what I've shown here is essentially the movement of modern humans, this is our species, Homo sapiens, throughout the world over the last 100,000 years. Our species evolves in Africa, and as it moves through the world, virtually everywhere it goes, waves of extinctions of large mammals follow. So when humans enter Australia, you lose about 60% of the large mammals. And when humans get into the Americas, you lose about 50% of the large mammals, things like woolly mammoths, giant ground salts, etc. And so that's what I've shown here is the one thing that's so characteristic of human-driven extinctions is that they're so size selective. They preferentially affect the largest species regardless of what the largest species is. And so what you're looking at here on this axis, this is body mass in kilograms. And you see this first, these red bars are the distribution of sizes for animals that went extinct in the Pleistocene because of humans. Here you're seeing those today that have gone extinct because of humans. Here are those threatened today because of humans. And then here are those today that are not threatened by human impacts. And what you see is clearly humans have basically downsized the world's large mammals over the last 100,000 years. The species we have today are in fact just the leftovers of extinctions that have been being caused by humans for 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 years. We live in a zoologically impoverished world, and humans are still knocking out large mammals today. And I just want to show this as the last example. This is sadly best exemplified by our very largest species, those left in Africa, like elephants, hippos, and rhinos. These maps in blue show the historical distribution of these species only 100 years ago, and the red color shows where they're found today. And so you can see so dramatically how humans have reshaped their geographic distributions even in the last 100 years. And so it's a grim outlook from the view of the fossil record for our largest bodied species, and as seen today clearly by maps like this.
So that sort of explains why or how the species like the giant moose and the giant sloth and the elephant bird and the great auk and all those wonderful, really large like megafauna just disappeared forever.
Yeah.
So my final question to you is, like, we've seen all the impacts, the human-driven impacts that to the world, and scary as it is, like, what hope does the fossil record give for the future, our future, Earth's future?
I think the fossil record gives us plenty of reasons to be optimistic about our ability to prevent biodiversity loss today, or the rebounding of biodiversity, if we can stop the impacts we're having on the world. So in the fossil record, through all those mass extinctions, even the most extreme ones when life was basically exterminated from the face of the earth, life rebounded. But it was given the opportunity to. And in a human-dominated world, that's the biggest question, is, are we willing to preserve regions of the world to let wildlife, go about their existence, or will we basically smother them out? So the fossil record is a reason to be cautiously optimistic, but we have to make serious changes.
So that it's such a dramatic visual that we have there, but thank you for giving us hope and encouraging us to be cautiously optimistic, John. So that brings me to the end of my questions, and all vignettes. So can we just field some final questions and then wrap it up? So the audience now knows what to do. So we're having a whole bunch of questions. So my first question is, so is there evidence that early humans hunted any of these mammals to extinction?
It's a debate I'm actually involved in. So I'll say this, so modern humans, Homo sapiens, our species, is certainly responsible for those extinctions that happened over the last 100,000 years, when we lost woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, ground sloths, all of that. People have suggested that humans have been causing extinctions in Africa, where humans evolved, for millions of years. That species 2 million years ago human species 2 million years ago were driving large mammal extinctions. That does not seem to be the case for a number of reasons, but I'm not going to go into them here. I'm happy to, but it would take a while. I don't want to eat up the time. But yeah, so modern humans certainly are responsible for the extinctions over the last 100,000 years. If humans have caused extinctions beyond that time, it doesn't seem so.
Is that like something that's widely debated in paleontological circles?
Not in paleontological circles. It's actually, so people who are interested in biodiversity loss today increasingly want to understand biodiversity loss in the past. And so you'll see many papers that start off with, humans have been causing extinctions in Africa for millions of years. And that's just not true. And so it's something I and a few colleagues from University of Colorado and University of Utah have been arguing against for the last few years. We actually just had a paper accepted on that 2 days ago. So, but it doesn't seem, human-driven extinctions are something relatively recent in terms of Earth history.
So we have a bunch of really nice questions. So the first one is, other than antelope and giraffes, what are some of your other favorite index fossils and why? Any field stories about times they've been particularly useful in your projects?
As far as index fossils, I'm not sure. The herbivores are really indicative of paleo environments. But in terms of vertebrates, sorry, go ahead.
So can you explain what an index fossil is before you answer that question?
Sure. So an index fossil can have a number of meanings. If you are interested in, say, oil geology, an index fossil to you is a particular species that signifies you're in rocks of a certain type or a certain time period. But when I use index fossil in terms of the African fossil record, I'm talking about species that provide paleoenvironmental information. And obviously the herbivores, as the animals eating the plants, provide the most information on ancient environments or ecosystems.
Our next question is, which mammal or reptile has existed the longest in the fossil record so far?
The answer is none. So the average duration that a species exists, at least in terms of vertebrate, is about 2 million years. That's the average duration for species in the vertebrate fossil record. And you'll often hear of things like crocodiles talked about as living fossils, but that's actually a myth. The modern species of crocodiles we have are less than 1 million years old in some cases, the living crocodiles and alligators. It's just that in terms of their anatomy, some of the fossil crocodiles are similar to those today, but they're different species completely. And there are tons of surprises. So even in the croc fossil record, we have species that are totally land living. We have herbivorous species of crocodile. So yeah, it's sort of a myth that there's such a thing as a living fossil.
What about coelacanths though?
Coelacanths, again, they have a primitive body plan. We see fishes from the Devonian 350 million years ago that look like the coelacanths we have today, but the actual species themselves are relatively young. So living fossil is often used in the sense of having an anatomy that's similar to something we see in the fossil record, but all those species are relatively young.
So the next question is, what aspects of the rocks give a hint to what age they are?
To get at that, you need to understand a little bit about geomorphology. So, for example, when we were looking for younger rocks in Ethiopia, we knew we had to go to an area that wasn't affected by a major tectonic reorganization of the broader area we were working in. And once we were able to get out of that region, the rocks of the right age are preserved. So the long story short is, at the Lucy site, you have a big lake, and that's what's preserving the fossils. But after 3 million years ago, that lake is replaced by a really high energy river system that's basically beating up and destroying any material that's getting into it. And that's essentially why we didn't have a fossil record in that area. When we move out a little bit and get away from that particular context, we have the rocks of the right age preserved, if that makes sense.
Which is somewhat related to the next question one of our audience members has. How do you identify what could qualify as a potential site today?
A lot of it is, so like I said, we will try to narrow in on a time period we want to hit, the right geological context, but then you have to go out and just look for some reasons. If you're, say, sampling the middle of what used to be an ancient lake, you're not going to find fossils. You need lakeshore environments or gentle river-like environments. So we can target in on time periods and particular rock types, but you actually have to go out there and do the sort of pilot work to see if there are actually fossils preserved.
Another question is, I have heard that loss of insect species is a serious issue now. Are there a lot of studies of insect fossils?
Insects are invertebrates, so their fossil record is not as good as animals that have backbones, vertebrates. But there are certain areas of the rock record where we have exceptional preservation of insects. One of those is just after the dinosaurs went extinct, the Earth was really, really, really warm. It was a greenhouse world, and we know insect diversity basically explodes then, and then comes back down as the Earth cools. But that's one glimpse of the evolution of insects we have in the fossil record. They don't have, the record's just not as complete.
So does that include things like amber and insects encased in amber?
It's these cases of exceptional preservation, but it's not a record that you would be able to estimate a natural baseline of insect diversity like we can with vertebrates, especially with mammals, which have an exceptional fossil record.
So we have one last question, and we'll try and wrap it up right after that. This is a quick one. What is your thought on criticism of impacts of methane from ruminants?
Sort of, there's there were lots of big ruminant animals in the Pleistocene that went extinct, and so I have a friend, Felisa Smith at the University of New Mexico, and she had a bet made at a bar if she could calculate how much methane a woolly mammoth produced, or an extinct ruminant, and she actually ended up writing a paper on it. And
Oh, wow.
so, yeah. So, I mean, sure, ruminants are a source of methane, but there were lots of large-bodied animals that existed in the past that put out methane too. The difference is they're just livestock; they're not wild animals. So they do live at denser, they have denser biomass than wild animals would, but it's not something I'm an expert on.
So thanks so much, John. That was fantastic. So I'd like to just wrap up with some thank yous. I'd like to thank John for joining us, the Life Science Cafe organizers for putting in so much work to prepare for this virtual edition of Science Cafe, and all of you for being such a great audience. We had some really fun questions, so that was awesome. Thanks for being engaged right to the end. And I hope to see many of you next month for a journey into the world of urban ecology with Paige Warren. And more information, again, is at oebsciencecafe.org. Stay safe and well, everyone. That's all for today.